The dust rose in clouds as the stagecoach disappeared over the horizon, carrying with it Sarah Ellis's last hope of a new beginning. The year was 1876, and the unforgiving Dakota Territory sun beat down on her tear-streaked face as she stood alone at the crude wooden platform that passed for a station in the settlement of Redemption Creek. Her luggage sat in a pathetic heap beside her, much like her dreams abandoned and forgotten. Sarah clutched the letter in her hand so tightly that the paper had begun to tear at the edges. The ink, once so promising with its declarations of love and security, now seemed to mock her. Franklin Blackwood, her fiancé of 6 months, had arranged for her journey from Boston, only to be conspicuously absent upon her arrival. The station master had awkwardly delivered the message Franklin had married another woman 3 days prior, a cattle baron's daughter with a substantial dowry. "No sense waiting, madam," the station master had said before retreating to his office, unable to bear witness to her devastation any longer. "Last coach back east don't come through for another fortnight." The hot wind whipped strands of auburn hair across her face as she stared at the empty road. 23 years old and utterly alone in a strange land, with only $18 to her name and nowhere to go. The small settlement of Redemption Creek sprawled before her, a dusty main street lined with wooden buildings, the promise of civilization a mere veneer over the untamed wilderness beyond. Sarah squared her shoulders and wiped her tears with the back of her gloved hand. She would not break. Not here, not now. Boston had nothing left for her parents dead from influenza 2 winters past, the family savings depleted by her father's gambling debts. This harsh new land was her reality now, however unwelcoming it might be. As she bent to gather her belongings, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her pause. A lone rider approached from the east, silhouetted against the setting sun. Sarah felt a flicker of apprehension as the figure drew closer, revealing a man astride a dappled gray stallion. He reined his horse to a stop a respectful distance away. Dust settled around him as he dismounted in one fluid motion. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by the shadow cast by his hat brim. His clothes were trail-worn but clean dark trousers, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest. No flashy spurs or fancy guns like the dangerous men her mother had warned her about. "Madam," he said, removing his hat to reveal sun-streaked brown hair and the kind of face that spoke of hard living and honest work. His eyes, startlingly blue against his tanned skin, held a question as they took in her tearful face and the luggage at her feet. "Seems like you might be in some trouble." Sarah lifted her chin, pride momentarily overriding her despair. "I'm perfectly fine, sir." His lips quirked slightly. "With respect, madam, folks who are perfectly fine don't generally stand crying at an empty station as the day's last coach pulls away." A fresh wave of humiliation washed over her. "My arrangements have fallen through," she admitted stiffly. The man nodded slowly, seeming to understand more than she'd said. "Ethan Morgan," he introduced himself, offering a calloused hand. "I run the Morgan Ranch about 5 miles west of town." "Sarah Ellis," she replied, briefly touching his hand in the proper manner, though propriety seemed absurd under the circumstances. Ethan Morgan studied her for a moment, then reached into his saddlebag. To Sarah's surprise, he withdrew a single wildflower, a vibrant purple coneflower that somehow had survived the journey in his bag. He held it out to her, his expression serious but kind. "You weren't left, Miss Ellis," he said quietly. "You were chosen. This land chooses who stays and who goes. And it looks to me like it's chosen you." The simple gesture, so unexpected in its gentleness, nearly undid her composure entirely. Sarah accepted the flower, her fingers trembling. "Now," Ethan continued pragmatically, "Redemption Creek's a small place but decent. Mrs. Holloway runs a boarding house for respectable women. I'd be happy to escort you there if you'd allow it." Sarah hesitated, weighing her limited options. This stranger seemed honorable enough, and the alternative was to remain alone as night approached in an unfamiliar town. "That would be most appreciated, Mr. Morgan," she finally said. Ethan nodded, gathering her bags with ease. "Storm's coming," he observed, glancing at the darkening sky to the west. "Best get you settled before it hits." As they walked the short distance into town, Sarah clutched the purple wildflower like a talisman. She had no way of knowing that this simple act of kindness from a stranger would be the first chapter in a story neither of them could have anticipated, a story that would unfold across the wild Dakota plains and change both their lives forever. Redemption Creek proved to be little more than a single dusty street lined with wooden buildings. A general store, a saloon, a small church, and what appeared to be a doctor's office made up the town's humble offerings. People moved with purpose, eyeing Sarah with undisguised curiosity as Ethan led her toward a two-story clapboard house at the edge of town. "Folks don't get many new faces around here," Ethan explained, noticing her discomfort under the scrutiny. "Especially not ladies from the East." "Is it that obvious?" Sarah asked. "Your boots haven't seen nearly enough dust," he replied with a hint of a smile, "and those gloves weren't made for rope burns." Before Sarah could respond, the door of the boarding house swung open to reveal a stout woman in her 50s, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Ethan Morgan, what trouble are you bringing to my doorstep now?" she called, though her tone held more affection than censure. "No trouble, Mrs. Holloway, just a lady in need of lodging." Ethan set Sarah's bags down on the porch. "Miss Sarah Ellis recently arrived from Boston. Miss Ellis, this is Mrs. Martha Holloway, finest cook in the territory and keeper of Redemption Creek's only respectable boarding house." Mrs. Holloway's shrewd eyes assessed Sarah from head to toe, softening when she noted the tear stains on her cheeks and the wildflower still clutched in her hand. "Another one, is it?" she said quietly to Ethan. "Afraid so," he replied. Mrs. Holloway sighed and shook her head. "Well, come in then, Miss Ellis. I've got a room available, though it's small. $2 a week, includes breakfast and supper." Relief washed over Sarah. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway, that's very fair." "I'll leave you in good hands then," Ethan said, replacing his hat. "Mrs. Holloway knows everyone worth knowing in these parts. She'll help you get situated." Sarah turned to him, suddenly anxious at the prospect of this one familiar face departing. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan. I don't know how I would have managed without your assistance." "No need for thanks. It's what neighbors do out here." He hesitated, then added, "I come to town every Saturday for supplies. Perhaps by then you'll have a better sense of your plans." With a nod to both women, he turned and strode back toward his horse. Sarah watched him go, the purple flower still in her hand, an unexpected anchor in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. Mrs. Holloway ushered her inside, the older woman's chatter filling the silence as she showed Sarah to a small but clean room on the second floor. The furnishings were sparse: a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a washstand with a cracked mirror, but compared to the prospect of spending the night outdoors, it seemed a palace. "Supper's at 6 sharp," Mrs. Holloway informed her. "There are 3 other ladies boarding at present. Miss Peterson teaches at the school, Miss Weber assists Dr. Griffith, and Mrs. Carson is our local seamstress. All respectable women." Her emphasis on the word respectable made it clear that maintaining such a reputation was a condition of residency. Left alone, Sarah sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the day crashing down upon her. She had journeyed over 1,000 miles to marry a man who had abandoned her without so much as a face-to-face goodbye. She was in a strange town with barely enough money to last a month. And yet, she looked at the wildflower still in her hand. "You weren't left," the cowboy had said. "You were chosen." The words echoed in her mind as she placed the flower carefully in the water pitcher on her washstand. Perhaps in some strange way he was right. This wasn't the future she had planned, but it was the one that lay before her now. And somehow she would find a way to make it her own. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the previous day's threatening storm having passed to the north. Sarah rose early, washed her face in the basin, and changed into one of her simpler dresses, a blue cotton that would be more practical for the frontier town than her finer clothes from Boston. Breakfast at Mrs. Holloway's consisted of biscuits, bacon, and strong coffee. Sarah was introduced to her fellow boarders, all of whom regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy once her situation became known. "That Franklin Blackwood is a scoundrel," declared Mrs. Carson, a widow in her 40s with capable hands and shrewd eyes. "You're not the first young woman he's sent for, only to change his mind when Cornelia Peterson's father offered a better deal." Sarah's cheeks burned with humiliation. "I'm not the first," No, dear. There was a girl last year from Philadelphia and another from Chicago before that. None stayed, of course, too ashamed, I suppose. Well, I have nowhere else to go, Sarah admitted, and limited funds with which to get there even if I did. Miss Peterson, the schoolteacher, spoke up. If you can read and write, Miss Ellis, you might be able to assist me at the school. It's not much pay, but the children need someone to help with the younger ones. I can also recommend you to Dr. Griffith, offered Miss Weber, a quiet woman with spectacles. He often needs help with his correspondence. Sarah was touched by their immediate offers of assistance. Thank you both. I would be grateful for any work. And I could use help with mending, added Mrs. Carson. My eyes aren't what they used to be for fine work. By the time breakfast concluded, Sarah had 3 potential sources of income, modest though they might be. The knot of panic in her chest began to loosen slightly. Perhaps survival in this place was possible after all. Her first day in Redemption Creek passed in a blur of introductions and orientations. The town, she discovered, was home to approximately 300 souls, most connected in some way to the ranches and farms that dotted the surrounding prairie. There was a small silver mining operation to the north, which accounted for the presence of the saloon and the occasional rowdiness that disturbed the town's otherwise sedate atmosphere. Sarah spent the morning at the schoolhouse with Miss Peterson, meeting the 20-odd children who attended with varying degrees of regularity. The afternoon found her at Dr. Griffith's office, learning his filing system and the basics of preparing patient records. By evening, she was tired but more hopeful than she had been since stepping off the stagecoach. The days that followed settled into a pattern. Mornings at the school, afternoons divided between the doctor's office and Mrs. Carson's mending work. The pay was indeed modest, but combined with her room and board, it allowed her to conserve her small savings rather than depleting them. The purple wildflower that Ethan Morgan had given her withered within days, but Sarah kept it pressed between the pages of her Bible, a reminder of the moment when despair had begun to give way to determination. Saturday arrived with a buzz of activity in town. It was, as Sarah quickly learned, the day when many of the outlying ranchers and farmers came in for supplies and socializing. She found herself watching the street from the schoolhouse window, hoping for a glimpse of the man who had first welcomed her to Redemption Creek. She spotted him around midday, riding into town on the same dappled gray horse. Ethan Morgan moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his surroundings, nodding greetings to those he passed. He disappeared into the general store just as the school day ended. Sarah hesitated, unsure if seeking him out would be proper. But her Eastern notions of propriety had already been stretched by necessity in this place, and she found herself walking toward the store with determined steps. The bell above the door jingled as she entered. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight outside, and it took a moment for her eyes to adjust. The store was crowded with Saturday shoppers, the air filled with the mingled scents of coffee, leather, tobacco, and spices. She spotted Ethan near the back, discussing something with the proprietor over a ledger. He looked up at the sound of the bell, his eyes finding hers across the room. Recognition sparked in his gaze, followed by something that might have been pleasure. He excused himself and made his way to her, threading between barrels and stacked goods with the same easy grace he showed on horseback. "Miss Ellis," he greeted her, doffing his hat. "You're looking well. Redemption Creek seems to agree with you." "Mr. Morgan," she replied, suddenly conscious of the other customer's curious glances. "I wanted to thank you again for your kindness last week. I've been fortunate to find work with Miss Peterson at the school and with Dr. Griffith." "Good folks, both of them," Ethan nodded approvingly. "And you're settling in at Mrs. Holloway's." "Yes, she's been very kind." Sarah hesitated, then added, "The wildflower you gave me, I've pressed it to keep as a reminder." Something in his expression shifted, a softening around his eyes. "Might be I could show you where more grow if you've an interest in such things. The prairie's full of them this time of year." The invitation, casual as it was, sent an unexpected flutter through Sarah's chest. "I would enjoy that very much, Mr. Morgan. Sunday after church, perhaps." "If you're attending, that is." "I am. Mrs. Holloway insists all her boarders attend services." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. Mrs. Holloway is a woman of strong convictions. I'll look for you afterward then." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the front of the store. A man staggered in, his clothes covered in dust and what appeared to be blood. "Morgan," he called, his voice strained. "Thank God you're here. There's been an accident at the Wilson place, barn collapse. Sam's trapped and they need men to help." All casual conversation ceased as the store emptied, men hurrying to mount their horses and ride to their neighbor's aid. Ethan gave Sarah an apologetic look. "Duty calls, Miss Ellis. I'll see you tomorrow, God willing." And with that, he was gone, swept up in the urgent response that seemed second nature to these frontier people. Sarah watched from the boardwalk as the men of Redemption Creek rode out, a cloud of dust rising behind them. There was something both terrifying and admirable about the way life and death situations were handled here with immediate action rather than deliberation. She made her way back to the boarding house, where Mrs. Holloway was already preparing supper, the news of the accident having spread through town with remarkable speed. "That's the way of things out here," the older woman explained as she vigorously kneaded bread dough. "Everyone comes running when there's trouble, because next time it might be your barn that collapses or your well that runs dry. It seems a hard life," Sarah observed. "Hard, yes, but not without its rewards." Mrs. Holloway gave her a shrewd look. "I saw you talking with Ethan Morgan at the store." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "He was merely being polite." "Ethan's not one for empty politeness," Mrs. Holloway said. "If he spoke to you, it's because he wanted to." "Good man, Ethan. Built that ranch from nothing after his father died, and he couldn't have been more than 20 at the time. He seems." Sarah searched for the right word. "Capable." Mrs. Holloway's laugh was knowing. "That he is, my dear, that he is." Later that evening, word came that Sam Wilson had been successfully rescued, though with a broken leg and several cracked ribs. The men had returned to town, tired and dust-covered but satisfied with their work. Sarah found herself wondering if Ethan had gone straight back to his ranch, or if he had stopped in town for a meal. Sunday morning arrived bright and clear. Sarah dressed with particular care in her best dress, a forest green that complemented her auburn hair. The church was a simple white wooden structure with a small steeple, unadorned save for a cross above the door. Inside, rough-hewn pews faced a plain pulpit, and clear glass windows let in the morning light. Sarah entered with Mrs. Holloway and the other boarders, taking a seat near the middle. As the congregation filtered in, she couldn't help searching for Ethan among the faces. She spotted him just as the service was about to begin, slipping into a pew near the back. Their eyes met briefly, and he nodded in greeting before turning his attention to the preacher. The service was simpler than those she had attended in Boston, the sermon more direct in its application to daily life on the frontier. The congregation sang hymns with enthusiasm if not perfect pitch, and there was a sense of genuine community that Sarah found deeply appealing. Afterward, people lingered outside, exchanging news and greetings in the warm sunshine. Sarah stood with her fellow boarders, half listening to their conversation while watching for Ethan. She finally spotted him in conversation with an elderly couple, his manner respectful as he listened to whatever the old man was saying. When he caught sight of her, he excused himself and made his way over, navigating through the crowd with a nod here and a brief word there. "Miss Ellis," he greeted her, hat in hand. "You remembered our arrangement, I hope?" "Of course, Mr. Morgan, though after yesterday's excitement I wasn't certain you would." "A promise is a promise," he said simply. "If you're ready, I thought we might ride out to see those wildflowers I mentioned. I've brought an extra horse gentle enough for a lady, but spirited enough to be interesting." Sarah hesitated. Riding alone with a man she barely knew went against everything she had been taught was proper. Yet something in Ethan Morgan's straightforward manner inspired trust, and the prospect of seeing more of this wild country appealed to her adventurous spirit. "I would be delighted," she decided. "Though I should warn you, my riding skills are modest at best." "The horse I've brought will compensate for any lack of experience," he assured her. "If Mrs. Holloway approves, of course." The boarding house mistress, who had been pretending not to eavesdrop, gave a crisp nod. "Be back before dark and mind you stick to the main trails." "The girl's reputation is in your hands, Ethan Morgan." Yes, madam, he replied seriously, though Sarah caught a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. I'll have her back safe and sound by supper time. A short time later, Sarah found herself astride a placid chestnut mare, following Ethan out of town toward the open prairie. Her riding habit, one of the few practical garments she had brought from Boston, allowed her to sit comfortably in the side saddle that Ethan had somehow procured for the occasion. You ride well for someone with modest skills, Ethan observed as they left the last buildings behind. My father insisted I learn, though opportunities were limited in the city, Sarah replied. He said a lady should be able to control a horse in case of emergency. Wise man, your father. He had his moments of wisdom, Sarah acknowledged, thinking of her father's gambling addiction with a pang of old sorrow. Though not enough to save our family fortune, I'm afraid. Ethan glanced at her with interest. Is that what brought you west, financial necessity? Partly, Sarah admitted. My parents died 2 years ago, leaving little but debts. I worked as a companion to an elderly lady until her death this spring. When Franklin Mr. Blackwood wrote with his proposal, it seemed providential. Until it wasn't, Ethan supplied, his tone gentle rather than judgmental. Yes. Until it wasn't. Sarah straightened in the saddle, determined not to dwell on her humiliation. And you, Mr. Morgan, have you always lived in Dakota Territory? Born in Missouri, but my father brought us west when I was 10. He had dreams of building a cattle empire. Ethan's expression grew distant. Died 6 years later from a kick to the head while breaking a wild stallion, left me the beginnings of a ranch and a mountain of ambition to live up to. I'm sorry for your loss, Sarah said softly. It was a long time ago, Ethan replied, but thank you. They rode in companionable silence for a time, the landscape opening up around them. The prairie stretched to the horizon, a sea of grass swaying in the breeze, dotted with wildflowers in purple, yellow, and white. In the distance, low hills provided the only break in the vast expanse of sky and land. It's beautiful, Sarah breathed, momentarily overwhelmed by the sheer openness of it all, so different from Boston. It takes some getting used to, Ethan acknowledged. Some folks can't handle all this space, makes them feel small and insignificant. Others find it freeing. And you, how does it make you feel? He considered the question seriously. Accountable, he finally said. Out here, there's nowhere to hide from yourself or your mistakes. The land demands honesty. Sarah pondered his words as they continued riding. After about an hour, Ethan led them toward a small creek lined with cottonwood trees, their leaves shimmering silver green in the light breeze. This is where I found that flower I gave you, he said, dismounting and tying his horse to a low branch. He came around to help Sarah down, his hands strong and sure at her waist as he lifted her effortlessly to the ground. For a brief moment, they stood close enough that Sarah could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, could feel the warmth of his hands through the fabric of her riding habit. Then he stepped back, properly releasing her, though something in his gaze suggested he had felt the same unexpected connection. The wildflowers are thickest along the creek bank, he said, his voice perhaps a touch rougher than before. There's a spot just ahead where the water pools that's particularly pretty. He offered his arm, and Sarah took it, allowing him to guide her along a narrow path through the tall grass. The creek burbled softly beside them, and birds called from the trees overhead. It was peaceful in a way that Sarah had never experienced in the city. They rounded a bend in the creek, and Sarah gasped in delight. The bank was carpeted in wildflowers, purple coneflowers like the one Ethan had given her, delicate white daisies and vibrant yellow black-eyed Susans, all swaying gently in the breeze. It's like a garden, she marveled, releasing his arm to move closer to the flowers. But with no gardener save nature itself. I thought you might appreciate it, Ethan said, watching her with evident pleasure at her reaction. Few people from back east see the beauty in this land. They're too busy complaining about what it lacks. Sarah knelt carefully to examine the flowers more closely, trailing her fingers over the soft petals. I can understand why you love it here, she said softly. There's a rawness to it, but also a grace. That's it exactly, Ethan agreed, sounding faintly surprised at her perception. Most people only see the rawness. He joined her by the creek bank, producing a small bundle from his saddlebag. I thought we might have a bite to eat if you're hungry. Nothing fancy, just some bread, cheese, and dried apple slices that Mrs. Holloway packed for us. She knew about this picnic. Sarah asked, surprised. Ethan's expression turned sheepish. I might have mentioned my intentions when I stopped by this morning to arrange for the horse. Mrs. Holloway is a firm believer in the civilizing power of a proper meal. Sarah laughed, charmed by his admission. Well then, we mustn't let her efforts go to waste. They sat on a fallen log near the creek, the simple meal spread between them. The bread was fresh, the cheese sharp, and the dried apples sweet with a hint of cinnamon. Sarah couldn't remember when food had tasted so good, perhaps because it was flavored with the fresh air and beautiful surroundings. Tell me about your ranch, she invited as they ate. You mentioned cattle, yes, though not as many as I'd like yet. About 100 head of longhorns, plus some crossbreeds I'm experimenting with, a dozen horses, including the 2 we're riding today, and enough land to expand considerably once I can afford more stock. It sounds impressive. It's a start, Ethan said modestly. The real challenge is making it through the winters. They're brutal out here, colder than anything you've likely experienced in Boston. So I've been warned, Sarah said. Mrs. Holloway has already begun instructing me on proper winter preparations. I gather it involves a great deal of knitting and preserving. Smart woman, Mrs. Holloway. Those who don't prepare don't survive. Ethan's tone was matter-of-fact rather than ominous. But there's beauty in winter, too, the way the snow blankets everything, the absolute stillness on clear days, the stars so bright and close you'd swear you could reach up and touch them. The way he described it made Sarah eager to experience a Dakota winter, despite all the warnings she'd received. His love for this land was evident in every word he spoke, in the way his eyes scanned the horizon as if checking on a beloved friend. May I ask you something, Mr. Morgan? Sarah ventured as they finished their meal. Ethan, please, and yes, you may ask me anything. Ethan, then. His name felt right on her lips. That day we met, when you gave me the flower, why did you stop? There must have been dozens of stranded travelers you've encountered over the years. He was quiet for a long moment, considering her question. Truthfully, something in your face. You were clearly heartbroken, but there was a determination there too. You weren't just weeping and waiting to be rescued. You were already figuring out what to do next. He glanced at her, a hint of admiration in his eyes. That kind of strength deserves acknowledgement. His answer touched her deeply. It wasn't flattery or empty words, but a genuine observation that saw her as she truly was, or at least, as she aspired to be. Thank you, she said simply. Not just for stopping that day, but for seeing me clearly. Something shifted between them in that moment, a deepening of understanding that needed no further words. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the play of light on the creek water and the dance of butterflies among the wildflowers. All too soon, it was time to return to town if they were to keep their promise to Mrs. Holloway. As they rode back, the conversation flowed easily between them, touching on books they had read, people they knew in common, and their hopes for the future. Sarah found herself reluctant to see the buildings of Redemption Creek appear on the horizon. This day with Ethan had been a revelation not just about him, but about herself and what she might find in this new life on the frontier. As they reached the edge of town, Ethan slowed his horse to match her mare's pace. Miss Ellis, Sarah, he began, his tone more formal than it had been by the creek. I've enjoyed your company greatly today, as I have yours, she replied honestly. I wonder if you might permit me to call on you again, perhaps next Sunday. Sarah felt a warm glow of pleasure at his request. I would like that very much, Ethan. He smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his weather-worn face and made him look younger than his years. Then it's settled. I'll see you next Sunday after church. They rode the rest of the way to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house in a contented silence, both aware that something significant had begun between them, though neither ready to name it just yet. As promised, they arrived well before supper time. Ethan helped Sarah dismount, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary at her waist. From the boarding house window, Sarah caught a glimpse of Mrs. Holloway's approving nod. Thank you for a lovely afternoon, Sarah said as Ethan prepared to leave. The pleasure was mine, he replied, his blue eyes warm as they met hers. Until next Sunday, Sarah. As she watched him ride away, leading the chestnut mare behind his gray stallion. Sarah realized with sudden clarity that the disaster of Franklin Blackwood's rejection had led her to something potentially far more valuable: a connection with a man of genuine character, and a life that, while challenging, offered a depth of experience she had never known in Boston. The purple wildflower pressed in her Bible had become more than just a memento of kindness. It was a promise of possibility, a reminder that sometimes being left behind was actually being set free for something better. That evening at supper, the other boarders tactfully avoided direct questions about her outing with Ethan Morgan, though their curious glances spoke volumes. Mrs. Holloway, however, had no such reservations. "Ethan showed you the wildflower meadow by Cottonwood Creek, I expect," she said as she passed the bread basket. "Yes, it was beautiful," Sarah replied, trying to keep her tone casual. "His mother loved that spot," Mrs. Holloway continued. "Used to take him there when he was a boy. He doesn't share it with just anyone." The simple statement carried significant weight, and Sarah found herself touched by the revelation that Ethan had shared something so personally meaningful with her. "He's asked to call on me again next Sunday," she admitted quietly. Mrs. Holloway nodded with satisfaction. "Good. The boy needs someone with sense and backbone. Too many silly girls around here who wouldn't last a winter on that ranch of his." "Mrs. Holloway," Sarah protested, feeling her cheeks warm, "it's just a social call." The older woman snorted. "Nothing's just anything with Ethan Morgan. He doesn't waste time on empty gestures." The days that followed took on a new brightness for Sarah. Her work at the school, the doctor's office, and with Mrs. Carson's mending continued. But now there was an anticipation underlying everything: the knowledge that Sunday would bring another opportunity to see Ethan. On Wednesday, an unexpected package arrived for her at the boarding house: a small book of poetry by Walt Whitman with a simple note. "These words remind me of the prairie and now of you. E.M." Sarah read the poems late into the night, entranced by Whitman's celebration of nature and the American spirit. One passage in particular stood out to her: the prairie grass dividing, its special odor breathing. "I demand of it the spiritual corresponding, demand the most copious and close companionship of men, demand the blades to rise of words, acts, beings." The words seemed to capture something essential about the land she was coming to know and the man who had introduced her to its beauty. Thursday brought another small gift: a perfectly formed arrowhead that Ethan had found on his property, delivered by a ranch hand who happened to be in town. Friday, it was a small sketch of the creek where they had picnicked, surprisingly well executed, revealing yet another facet of Ethan's character. By the time Sunday arrived, Sarah was in a state of pleasant anticipation that both excited and alarmed her. It seemed impossible that she could develop such feelings for a man she had known for such a short time, and yet there was an undeniable connection between them that transcended conventional courtship. Church service that morning seemed interminable, though Sarah dutifully focused on the sermon about faith in times of trial. Afterward, she found Ethan waiting outside, dressed in his Sunday best: a dark coat that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and clean trousers that had clearly been pressed for the occasion. "Good morning, Sarah," he greeted her, the warmth in his eyes belying the formality of his words. "I hope you're well." "Very well, thank you," she replied, "and thank you for the gifts. They were thoughtful and unexpected. I'm glad they pleased you." He offered his arm. "I thought we might walk to the river today if that suits you. It's not far and the view is worth the effort." With Mrs. Holloway's approving nod, they set off, walking at a leisurely pace through town and beyond. The river, when they reached it, was wide and swift, its waters reflecting the clear blue sky above. They found a shaded spot on the bank where they could sit and watch the water flow past. "I wanted to ask you something," Ethan said after they had settled. "Something that's been on my mind since we met." Sarah's heart quickened at his serious tone. "Yes. What are your intentions regarding Redemption Creek? Do you plan to stay, or is this just a temporary stop until you can return east?" The directness of his question took her by surprise, though she appreciated his straightforwardness. "I've been asking myself the same thing," she admitted. "When I first arrived, I was devastated and would have returned to Boston immediately if I could have afforded it. But now, he prompted when she hesitated, "now I'm beginning to see possibilities here that I never anticipated." She met his gaze steadily. I'm not certain what the future holds, but I'm no longer in a hurry to leave. Relief flickered across his features. I'm glad to hear it, because I have a proposition for you, Sarah Ellis, and it would be considerably complicated if you were planning to depart. A proposition. She echoed, both intrigued and wary. My ranch is growing, as I mentioned. I've recently secured a contract to supply beef to the army post north of here, which means expansion. Expansion means more hands, more cattle, more of everything. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. I need someone to help manage the household aspects, accounts, correspondence, supplies, and eventually to oversee the hiring of staff. Sarah blinked, trying to process what he was suggesting. Are you offering me employment, Ethan? In a manner of speaking, yes. Though it would be more of a partnership than traditional employment. He looked at her intently. You're educated, capable, and not afraid of hard work. The position comes with room and board, of course, and a share of the ranch's profits. I don't know what to say, Sarah stammered, caught off guard by the unexpected offer. It's very generous, but it wouldn't be proper for an unmarried woman to live at a bachelor's ranch, Ethan finished for her, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I'm well aware of the conventions, Sarah. That's why my proposition includes a suggestion that would address that particular concern. Understanding dawned slowly. Ethan Morgan, are you proposing marriage as a business arrangement? Not exactly, he replied, having the grace to look slightly abashed. I'm proposing a business arrangement that could, with time and mutual agreement, develop into something more personal. I'm not asking for immediate acceptance, only that you consider the possibility. Sarah sat in stunned silence, her mind racing. The proposal was unconventional to say the least, yet there was something refreshingly honest about it. Ethan wasn't offering empty romantic promises or false pretenses. He was suggesting a practical partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals, with the potential for deeper feelings to develop naturally. This is unexpected, she finally managed. I know it's sudden, Ethan acknowledged, and I wouldn't blame you for thinking me presumptuous. But out here, Sarah, life moves at a different pace. People make decisions based on character and capability rather than years of formal courtship. I've seen enough of your character to know that you're someone I could build a life with. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah found herself deeply moved by his words, unconventional though they might be. May I have some time to consider? She asked. Of course. Take all the time you need. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, pressing it into her palm. This belonged to my mother. I'd like you to have it while you think about my offer. Sarah opened her hand to find a simple silver locket, worn smooth by years of handling. When she opened it, she found a tiny portrait of a woman with Ethan's blue eyes and a pressed flower petal purple, like the coneflower he had given her on the day they met. Ethan, I can't accept this. It's too precious. All the more reason for you to have it, he insisted gently. Whatever your decision, I want you to know that I entrust you with what matters most to me. The depth of feeling behind the gesture left Sarah speechless. They sat in silence for a time, watching the river flow past, each lost in their own thoughts. The walk back to town was quieter than their journey out, but not uncomfortably so. At the boarding house steps, Ethan took her hand. I'll be in town again on Wednesday for the Cattlemen's Association meeting, he said. Perhaps we could speak then, if you've had time to consider my proposal. Wednesday, Sarah agreed, her heart full of conflicting emotions. Thank you, Ethan, for your honesty and for seeing something in me worth investing in, he smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. The investment goes both ways, Sarah Ellis. Remember that while you're deciding. With a tip of his hat, he was gone, leaving Sarah to climb the boarding house steps with her thoughts in turmoil and a silver locket clutched in her hand. Mrs. Holloway took one look at her face and herded her into the kitchen, away from the curious eyes of the other boarders. So he's asked you, has he? The older woman said without preamble, pouring Sarah a cup of strong tea. You knew? Sarah asked, not entirely surprised. Ethan stopped by yesterday to discuss it with me, wanted my opinion on whether you might be receptive. Mrs. Holloway sat across from her, her expression unusually gentle. He's a good man, Sarah. One of the best I've known. And he's offering you something rare, a chance to build something meaningful together as equals. But we barely know each other, Sarah protested, though the argument sounded weak even to her own ears. You know enough, Mrs. Holloway countered. You know he's honorable, hardworking, and treats you with respect. You know he sees your worth beyond your pretty face. Out here, that's a solid foundation to build on. Sarah traced the pattern of the locket with her fingertips, considering the older woman's words. Did you know his mother, Margaret? Yes, I knew her well. She was much like you came west with dreams that got derailed, but found something better in the end. She taught Ethan to value strength of character over empty appearances. It's why he recognized something in you right away. The comparison to Ethan's mother touched Sarah deeply. She thought of the pressed flower petal in the locket, a tangible connection between past and present, between the woman who had shaped Ethan and the woman he now saw as a potential partner in life. What if I'm not strong enough for this life? Sarah whispered, voicing her deepest fear. What if I fail him? Mrs. Holloway reached across the table to pat her hand. My dear, the very fact that you're asking that question tells me you have exactly the kind of strength needed. The weak don't worry about failing others, they're too busy protecting themselves. The next 3 days passed in a blur of work and contemplation for Sarah. She went through her duties at the school and the doctor's office mechanically, her mind constantly returning to Ethan's proposal and the decision before her. On Tuesday evening, unable to sleep, she took out the book of poetry Ethan had given her and reread the passages he had marked. One in particular seemed to speak directly to her current dilemma. Not I, nor anyone else can travel that road for you. You must travel it by yourself. It is not far. It is within reach. Perhaps you have been on it since you were born and did not know. By Wednesday morning, Sarah had reached her decision. She dressed with care in her green dress, the one she had worn to church on that first Sunday with Ethan, and pinned the silver locket at her throat. The Cattlemen's Association met in a room above the general store, and Sarah positioned herself on a bench across the street, waiting for the meeting to conclude. As men began to emerge from the building, she spotted Ethan's tall figure among them, his expression serious as he discussed something with an older rancher. When he saw her sitting there, his conversation faltered, and he excused himself to cross the street to her side. Sarah, he greeted her, removing his hat. I wasn't expecting to see you until later. I couldn't wait, she admitted, rising to her feet. I've made my decision, Ethan. His expression grew carefully neutral, though she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. And I accept your proposal, both the business arrangement and the possibility of something more. She met his gaze steadily, but I have conditions of my own. A smile began to form at the corners of his mouth. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. What are your terms, Miss Ellis? First, I want a full partnership in the ranch operations, not just the household management. I have a good head for numbers and strategy, and I want to use it. Ethan nodded, his smile growing. Agreed, what else? Second, I want us to be honest with each other always. No matter how difficult the truth might be. That's a condition I can wholeheartedly endorse, he said. Is there a third? Sarah took a deep breath. Yes, I want us to give ourselves time to know each other properly before we marry. A season at least. I'll move to the ranch as your business partner and housekeeper, with Mrs. Holloway as chaperone until she deems it appropriate for us to wed. Ethan's eyebrows rose at this last condition. You've discussed this with Mrs. Holloway already? Last night, Sarah confirmed. She's agreed to come, provided we build her a small cabin of her own on the property. She says she's too old to listen to young folks mooning about at all hours. A laugh escaped him then, warm and genuine. Mrs. Holloway has a way with words. He grew more serious, studying her face. Are you certain about this, Sarah? It won't be an easy life. I'm certain, she replied, feeling the truth of it in her bones. Not because it will be easy, but because it will be worthwhile, because we'll build something together that matters. Without warning, Ethan stepped forward and took her hands in his. Then I accept your conditions, Sarah Ellis, and look forward to our partnership in all its forms. His touch sent a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the summer sun above them. In that moment, standing on the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. When can you be ready to leave for the ranch? Ethan asked, still holding her hands. Mrs. Holloway says we can be packed and ready by Saturday, Sarah replied. I've already spoken with Miss Peterson and Dr. Griffith about my departure. Saturday it is, then. He squeezed her hands gently before releasing them. I'll bring the wagon in the morning. As they parted ways, Ethan to finish his business in town, Sarah to continue her preparations, she touched the silver locket at her throat, feeling a sense of rightness that transcended all her previous doubts. That night, she wrote a letter to her cousin in Boston, the only family member with whom she still maintained correspondence. In it, she described her arrival in Redemption Creek, the betrayal by Franklin Blackwood, and her unexpected meeting with Ethan Morgan. She wrote of the wildflower he had given her when she stood alone and heartbroken, and of his words that had changed her perspective. You weren't left, you were chosen. She concluded the letter with a description of her decision to accept Ethan's proposal, and the new life she was embarking upon not as the desperate last resort she had once feared, but as a deliberate choice to embrace a future filled with challenge and promise. As she sealed the envelope, Sarah realized that the pressing heaviness that had accompanied her journey west had lifted. In its place was a quiet determination and, more surprisingly, a budding joy at the prospect of the life ahead, a life she had chosen for herself, with a man who saw her true worth. Saturday dawned clear and cool, with the first hints of autumn in the air. Sarah packed the last of her belongings, considerably fewer than she had arrived with, having sold or traded many of her impractical Eastern clothes and trinkets for items more suited to ranch life. Mrs. Holloway supervised the loading of her own possessions onto the wagon Ethan had brought, directing the placement of each trunk and box with military precision. For a woman who had lived in the same boarding house for 15 years, she seemed remarkably untroubled by the prospect of change. Been waiting for the right reason to move on, she explained when Sarah commented on her calm demeanor. You and Ethan are it. The journey to the Morgan Ranch took most of the day, the wagon moving at a steady but unhurried pace through the rolling prairie. As they traveled, Ethan pointed out landmarks and boundaries, giving Sarah her first real sense of the scope of the operation she was joining. That's our northern pasture, he said, indicating a vast expanse of grassland dotted with grazing cattle. Best grass on the property, so we save it for the breeding stock. To the west, beyond that ridge, is where we're expanding another 1,000 acres that I purchased last spring. Sarah tried to absorb it all, impressed by the scale and organization evident in Ethan's descriptions. This was no small family farm, but a serious business operation with significant potential for growth. They crested a small hill in the late afternoon, and suddenly the ranch headquarters came into view in the valley below. A substantial 2-story house of weathered wood stood at the center, surrounded by a collection of outbuildings, a large barn, bunkhouse, smithy, and several smaller structures whose purposes Sarah could only guess at. It's larger than I expected, she admitted, taking in the scene. My father had big dreams, Ethan replied. The house was one of them, built at twice the size we needed, saying we'd grow into it. Turns out he was right, just not in the way he anticipated. As they approached, several men emerged from the buildings to greet them, ranch hands curious about the new arrivals. Ethan made introductions all around, his tone making it clear that Sarah was to be respected as his business partner and future wife. Mrs. Holloway was shown to a small but well-built cabin near the main house, clearly prepared in advance for her arrival, while Ethan led Sarah into the house itself. The interior was surprisingly spacious and well-appointed, though with a distinctly masculine simplicity that spoke of years without a woman's touch. The front parlor featured comfortable if somewhat worn furniture, bookshelves filled with a mix of practical manuals and classic literature, and large windows that captured the western light. It's lovely, Sarah said sincerely, running her hand along the back of a leather armchair. Your father built well. He did, Ethan agreed. Though it's never felt quite like a home, more like a place to eat and sleep between work days. Sarah looked around, already seeing possibilities for small changes that would soften the space without diminishing its character. That can change, she said with confidence. Ethan showed her through the rest of the house, a formal dining room they rarely used, a study filled with ranch records and correspondence, a large kitchen with a massive wood stove, and upstairs 4 bedrooms and a small sitting area. This will be your room, he said, opening the door to a pleasant chamber with windows facing east. It was my mother's sewing room, but I've had it converted. My room is across the hall and the other two are for guests, though we rarely have any. The room was simply furnished but comfortable, with a bed, dresser, washstand, and small writing desk. Someone had placed a vase of wildflowers on the windowsill, purple coneflowers and black-eyed Susans, like those from their picnic spot. "The flowers are a nice touch," Sarah commented, touched by the thoughtfulness. "Maria's doing our cook," Ethan explained. "She comes in from town 3 days a week to prepare meals and handle the basic cleaning. She was quite excited when I told her you'd be joining us." "I look forward to meeting her. You will tomorrow. For tonight, Mrs. Holloway has insisted on preparing our first meal here." He hesitated, then added, "I thought perhaps after dinner we might go over the ranch accounts. I'd value your perspective on our financial position." Sarah nodded, appreciating that he was immediately including her in the business aspects as promised. "I'd like that very much." That evening set the pattern for the days that followed. Sarah quickly established herself as an integral part of the ranch operations, taking over the account books and correspondence with a natural efficiency that impressed even Mrs. Holloway. She worked alongside Ethan in planning the expansion, offering suggestions based on her knowledge of Eastern markets and financial structures that he hadn't considered. In the house, she made subtle changes that transformed the bachelor dwelling into a true home: curtains at the windows, cushions on the hard chairs, arrangements of wildflowers and grasses that brought the beauty of the prairie indoors. She worked with Maria to establish routines for meals and cleaning that made the large house function smoothly without unnecessary fuss. Ethan, for his part, made good on his promise to treat her as a full partner. He consulted her on major decisions, taught her about cattle breeding and range management, and introduced her to the network of ranchers and merchants who formed the backbone of the regional economy. As autumn deepened toward winter, their working partnership developed a comfortable rhythm. More surprising to Sarah was the personal relationship that was developing alongside it. Each evening after dinner, they would sit in the parlor, Sarah often with mending or knitting in hand, Ethan with a book or ranch ledger, and talk about their days, their thoughts, their memories and hopes. She learned about his childhood journey west, about the mother who had taught him to appreciate beauty in unexpected places, and the father whose ambition had shaped his sense of responsibility. He, in turn, listened as she spoke of her parents, her education, and the dreams she had harbored in Boston that now seemed like memories from another life. They disagreed, sometimes Sarah advocating for more rapid expansion into new markets, Ethan counseling caution based on his experience with the unpredictable Dakota, but their disagreements were respectful, often leading to compromises that incorporated the best of both perspectives. Physical affection between them developed gradually, beginning with casual touches, his hand at her elbow as they walked, her fingers brushing his as she passed him a document, the brief pressure of his palm against her back as he guided her through a gate. These moments of contact, innocent as they were, sent a warmth through Sarah that both thrilled and unnerved her. The first snowfall came in early November, transforming the prairie into a glittering white expanse overnight. Sarah woke to find the world outside her window transformed, the familiar landscape rendered new and magical by the blanket of white. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Ethan already at the kitchen table, studying weather reports with a furrowed brow. "It's beautiful," she said, pouring herself coffee from the pot on the stove. He looked up, his expression softening as he took in her excitement. "It is, though it's earlier than I'd like. We still have cattle to move from the north pasture before the deep cold sets in. Can I help?" Sarah asked impulsively. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "With the cattle drive, it's hard work, Sarah, and the weather will be unpredictable." "I know," she replied, lifting her chin. "But I want to understand every aspect of the ranch, not just the parts that can be managed from behind a desk." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but you'll need warmer clothes than what you have now, and you'll ride with me, not on your own." Sarah agreed readily to these conditions, excited at the prospect of experiencing this fundamental aspect of ranch life. Mrs. Holloway, when informed of the plan, merely snorted and produced a set of woolen underwear, heavy socks, and a fur-lined jacket that she insisted Sarah would need. Girls got spirit. the older woman commented to Ethan as they prepared to leave the next morning. Good thing, too. Winter on the prairie sorts out the dreamers from the doers right quick. The cattle drive was unlike anything Sarah had experienced before, exhausting, exhilarating, and occasionally terrifying as they moved the herd through snow-covered terrain with a storm threatening on the horizon. She rode double with Ethan as promised, her arms around his waist as his horse picked its way through drifts and across partially frozen streams. The ranch hands, initially skeptical of the city woman joining their work, gradually came to respect her determination and willingness to learn. By the time they returned to the ranch 3 days later, cold, tired, and mud-splattered but successful in their mission, Sarah felt she had passed some unspoken test in their eyes and perhaps in her own as well. That night, as they sat before the fire in the parlor, Ethan reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "You surprised them out there," he said quietly. "Not me, though. I already knew what you were made of." Sarah looked at their joined hands, then up at his face, shadowed in the firelight. "And what am I made of, Ethan Morgan?" "The same thing as this land," he replied, his blue eyes intent on hers. "Beauty and strength in equal measure. Uncompromising when it matters, but generous to those who treat you with respect." His words stirred something deep within her, a recognition of truth that transcended the conventional romantic phrases she had once expected from a suitor. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she said simply, the admission feeling both momentous and inevitable. Ethan's hand tightened on hers. "I think I started falling the moment I saw you standing alone at that station," he confessed, though I didn't recognize it for what it was until later. He leaned forward then, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "May I kiss you, Sarah Ellis?" "Yes," she whispered, her heart racing. "Please." His lips were warm and surprisingly gentle as they met hers, the kiss tentative at first, then deepening as she responded. Sarah felt a sense of rightness, of coming home, that made all her previous doubts seem insignificant. When they finally parted, Ethan rested his forehead against hers, his breathing slightly unsteady. "I think Mrs. Holloway might need to reconsider her timeline for our wedding," he murmured. Sarah laughed softly. "She already has. She informed me yesterday that spring would be soon enough, but not a day later." "Wise woman, Mrs. Holloway," Ethan said, smiling as he drew Sarah closer for another kiss. As winter settled fully over the Dakota Territory, life at the Morgan Ranch developed a rhythm dictated by the season. Days were filled with the necessary work of keeping the cattle fed and healthy, maintaining buildings against the onslaught of snow and ice, and planning for the spring expansion. Evenings were spent in the warmth of the house, with books, conversation, and increasingly, moments of tenderness between Sarah and Ethan. Christmas brought a gathering of neighboring ranchers and their families, the house filled with more people than it had seen in years. Sarah, with Mrs. Holloway's assistance, prepared a feast that earned her the approval of even the most traditional ranch wives. The silver locket Ethan had given her now, containing a small photograph of the two of them that a traveling photographer had taken in town, gleamed at her throat as she moved among their guests, every inch the ranch mistress. "You've brought life back to this place," one elderly rancher commented, his roomy eyes taking in the festive decorations and the easy way Sarah interacted with Ethan. Margaret would have approved. The comparison to Ethan's mother, coming from someone who had known her, filled Sarah with a deep sense of belonging. This was her home now, these people her community, in a way that Boston had never truly been. Winter gradually gave way to spring, the snow receding to reveal the first green shoots of prairie grass. With the changing season came increased activity, new calves being born, fences requiring repair after the winter's damage, preparations for the expansion Ethan and Sarah had planned together. Their wedding was set for early April, time to precede the busiest season of ranch work. It would be a simple affair at the small church in Redemption Creek, followed by a celebration at the ranch for friends and neighbors. As the day approached, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. The crushing disappointment of Franklin Blackwood's rejection, which had once seemed like the end of all her hopes, now appeared as merely a necessary detour that had led her to where she truly belonged. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of new growth across the prairie. In her room at the ranch, Sarah prepared with Mrs. Holloway's assistance, dressing in a gown of cream-colored silk that the older woman had helped her sew. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Holloway said, securing the last of the small wildflowers they had gathered that morning into Sarah's upswept hair. "And more importantly, you look happy." "I am happy," Sarah replied, touching the silver locket at her throat, her something old for the wedding day. "Happier than I ever imagined possible when I stood alone at that station last summer." Mrs. Holloway nodded approvingly. "That's because you weren't just waiting to be rescued, you were ready to rescue yourself if needed. Ethan saw that, and it's why he loves you." The small church in Redemption Creek was filled to capacity when Sarah arrived, every rancher and townsperson for miles around having turned out for the occasion. As she walked down the aisle on the arm of Dr. Griffith, who had volunteered to give her away, Sarah's eyes were fixed on Ethan waiting at the altar. He looked handsome in his new suit, his hair neatly trimmed for the occasion, but it was the expression on his face as he watched her approach that made Sarah's heart swell with emotion. There was pride there and joy, but most of all a deep, abiding love that needed no flowery words or grand gestures to express itself. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, their vows spoken clearly in voices that carried to every corner of the church. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan's kiss was both tender and promising, a perfect balance of public propriety and private passion. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with food and drink flowing freely, music from local fiddle players, and dancing that grew increasingly enthusiastic as the night progressed. Sarah moved among their guests with natural grace, now truly the mistress of Morgan Ranch in name as well as practice. As the festivities began to wind down, Ethan found her standing on the porch of their home, taking a moment of quiet to absorb the reality of the day. "Happy, Mrs. Morgan?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "Completely," she replied, leaning into him as his arm circled her waist, "though I still can't quite believe how much my life has changed in less than a year." "For the better, I hope," he said, a hint of question in his tone. Sarah turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch his cheek. "For the best, Ethan. I was left standing alone that day, but now I understand it was so I could be found by you." He smiled, his blue eyes warm in the lamplight spilling from the house. "I told you then that you weren't left, you were chosen. I didn't realize at the time that I was the one doing the choosing and being chosen in return." "The land chose both of us," Sarah said, echoing his words from their first meeting, "and brought us together." Ethan leaned down to kiss her, a kiss that held all the promise of their future together, the challenges they would face, the joys they would share, the life they would build as equal partners in love and work. Inside, their guests were beginning to depart, calling farewells and well wishes as they mounted horses and climbed into wagons for the journey home. Mrs. Holloway directed the cleanup with her usual efficiency, giving the newlyweds this moment of privacy before they would need to return to their duties as host and hostess. Standing there in the gentle spring evening, with the sounds of celebration behind them and the vast prairie stretching before them, Sarah and Ethan Morgan embodied the spirit of the West itself, resilient, adaptable, and ultimately triumphant over adversity through the strength of their commitment to each other and the land they called home. The purple wildflower Ethan had given Sarah on that first day, now carefully preserved between the pages of her Bible, had become more than a memento. It was a symbol of the truth they had both discovered. Sometimes what appears to be abandonment is actually the beginning of something far more valuable: a chosen life, a chosen love, and a future limited only by the horizon. 5 years later, Sarah stood on the porch of the Morgan Ranch house, watching as Ethan taught their 3-year-old son, James, to ride his first pony. The little boy's delighted laughter carried across the yard, mingling with the happy gurgling of the 6-month-old daughter cradled in Sarah's arms. The ranch had flourished under their joint stewardship, expanding to become one of the most successful operations in the territory. The original house had been enlarged to accommodate their growing family, and the number of employees had tripled as they diversified into breeding horses as well as cattle. Mrs. Holloway still lived in her cabin, though she now had help from a younger woman in managing the household affairs. She doted on the children, declaring them proper Dakota stock with evident pride. Sarah's cousin from Boston had visited the previous summer, arriving with the same trepidation Sarah herself had felt years earlier. She had departed 3 weeks later with a newfound respect for the life Sarah had built, and a budding romance with a neighboring rancher that continued through regular correspondence. As Ethan lifted James from the pony and set him on his shoulders, turning to walk back toward the house, Sarah felt the familiar surge of love and gratitude that had become the foundation of her life here. The path that had led her to this moment had been unexpected and at times difficult, but she wouldn't change a single step. Ethan climbed the porch steps, setting James down to run to his mother. He leaned in to kiss Sarah, then the top of their daughter's downy head. "What are you thinking about, looking so serious?" he asked, his blue eyes as kind and perceptive as they had been on the day they met. Sarah smiled, shifting the baby to one arm so she could reach up and touch the silver locket that still hung around her neck. Inside, pressed against the tiny portrait of Ethan's mother, was a single dried petal from the purple coneflower he had given her at the stagecoach station, the flower that had started everything. "I was thinking about being chosen," she said simply. "And how sometimes the best things in life come to us not through careful planning, but through what appears at first to be disaster." Ethan nodded, understanding as he always did the deeper currents of her thoughts. "The wildflower only blooms after the prairie fire has cleared the way," he said, quoting one of the sayings his mother had taught him. "Exactly." Sarah looked at their children, at the thriving ranch around them, and finally at the man who had offered her a flower and a future when she stood alone and heartbroken. And what a bloom it has been. As the Dakota sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, the Morgan family went inside together, closing the door on the wild prairie that had first separated them, then brought them together, and finally become the backdrop for a life neither could have imagined on that fateful day at Redemption Creek Station, a life chosen, built, and cherished through all its seasons.